Welcome. My name is George Perkovich. I'm a vice president for studies at the Carnegie Endowment, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this morning to the launch of a truly excellent book called Cyber Persistence Theory by Michael Fischerkeller, Emily Goldman, and Richard Harknett. I can't commend it highly enough, and we are very graced to have all three authors with us this morning. I'll introduce them briefly, then I'll ask them some questions, and then we'll open it up, and there's a way to take questions as we're going. Emily Goldman is a cyber strategist at the U.S. Cyber Command and National Security Agency Combined Action Group. Her governmental work has included service with U.S. CENTCOM, the State Department, and the Defense Department. And before that, from 1989 to 2008, she was an associate professor at the University of California at Davis, a university that when I was 10, I was determined I was going to go to because I wanted to be a veterinarian. But I've always been fond of UC Davis. Richard Harknett is a professor of political science and director of the School of Public and International Affairs and co-director of the Cyber Rage Institute and chair of the Center for Cyber Strategy and Policy at the University of Cincinnati. So you can see that he's a very busy person. In 2016, and that was when we first met, he was the first scholar in residence at U.S. Cyber Command and the NSA, where he worked also with Emily there. And then Michael Fischerkeller, who many of you know, is a research staff member in the Information Technology and Systems Division at the Institute for Defense Analyses, which is one of the fine federally funded research institutes in the U.S. He spent over 20 years there supporting the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs, and the combatant and multinational force commanders. So we have an excellent set of authors who have written, I think, a terrific book that is at once very accessible, blessedly short, actually, for being as ambitious as it is, and quite clear. So I'm looking forward to talking with them and you about it. Let me begin by I don't want to ask you guys to summarize the book, because I want to get into some of the big questions. But if I got it right, your main arguments are that with cyber operations, the historical strategies of conventional defense and deterrence and warfighting, and then later nuclear deterrence, don't really work. And instead, when it comes to cyber capabilities and cyber competition, we have persistent engagement with adversaries, not the absence of engagement, which is the goal of deterrence, and not violent armed conflict, as with conventional defense. And you then describe, I think, very accessibly, the technological and structural reasons why engagement is persistent and that it need not be very destructive. So I have one question about that, and then I want to ask some more political strategic questions and draw out some implications of the book. But the techno-structural question is, has the operator community and the technology community, have they basically accepted your analysis of the environment, including a key point, I think, that that environment is at the macro level quite resilient? And if they have challenged it, what are the major lines of critique of kind of the structural assessment?
Good morning, George, and I'm going to sort of kick us off here. First of all, I want to thank Carnegie for hosting us. I want to make a disclaimer that my remarks represent my own personal remarks as a researcher and scholar, and are not reflecting the official position of any U.S. government agency. So let me take a first crack at that. And we can't speak to the operator community at large, right? But what I can say is that the ideas that emerged in the book were really kind of developed in tandem between the scholarly perspective and the operational community. So when Richard and Michael and I were at U.S. Cyber Command in 2016, 2017, and having these conversations, what we could see was that the operators understood that what they were doing wasn't working. Okay, they could see that the losses that we as a country were experiencing because of this. They just didn't really have a language and a logic to explain it. And so what this did, having theorists of deterrence and strategic studies come in, was to give them sort of that language and that logic and that lexicon. So I think that in that respect, it's been very well received. It's become embedded in strategic documents. It's also being embedded in joint doctrine, in military doctrine. So for the military community, that's a very important representation of the acceptance. So I think all of those are positive signs. I would just like to make one. I'm sure Michael and Richard will make this comment, but I'll make it first. The book is about persistence as a theory, and persistent engagement is how the United States has operationalized that. And so we just want to make sure that we recognize the difference between what the theory says incentivizes states to behave a certain way, and then how different states might operationalize those imperatives. So I'll stop there and turn it over to my co-authors.
Richard, Michael, I think we need your mic on. I don't know if it's on our end or your end. There you go.
Thank you.
You're good.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm just going to speak very briefly to the issue of macro resilience. So I think the operational community, as Emily says, is aligned with what the argument we make in the book regarding macro resilience. But we all know that outside the operational community, there are concerns about macro resilience. So the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, for example, is promoting a norm of protecting the public core of the internet, right? And that reflects a concern that state actors may go after the public core. But, the logic in our book suggests that states aren't incentivized to do that, that states recognize the cyber strategic environment is an environment in and through which they can make strategic gains. And so they're really rather disincentivized to break the internet or to take down the internet. I'll pass that over to Richard now.
Right, good. Richard.
Yeah, George, just to amplify some of these things, I think, it's a great question because I think that there's been just sort of a main hurdle rather than necessarily a critique. And that is that the logic of initiative persistence, this core construct that the book is anchored on, basically takes us out of the comfort zone of legacy language and operational distinctions. So I remember when we were in early briefs on this, I was brought in on this scholar in residence context. Some people regarded me more Waltzian on nuclear deterrence stability than Waltz, right? And then my work on conventional deterrence contestability. And I remember one senior official sort of leaning over and saying, "Now wait a second, we brought you in as the deterrence guy, right? So what is this, like Nixon goes to China kind of thing?" So the bottom line was that we were feeding off of, as Emily said, what was occurring in the operational space and what the lessons that were being learned, but what was the framework and the logic. The hurdle really was sort of this legacy in conceptual and analytical forms. And so one of those, George, is at the technical and operational fluidity that we describe in the book, and the notion that it leads to this imperative to persist really requires an analytical break from offense-defense analytical framing, right? Whether we're talking about advantage in the conventional strategic environment, offense-defense advantage, or whether we're talking about offense dominance in the nuclear strategic environment. But that's really hard to do, right? When authorities, training, doctrine talk about offense and defense, in cyber operations. And that's why, the subtitle of the book is Redefining National Security. Yeah. And that redefinition rests on understanding how persistence really requires a different outcome measure. As you noted in your opening, right? Deterrence, the measure of success was the absence of action. And here we're coming along and saying, well, security requires action, right? Do you have the initiative in anticipating exploitation. And that's fundamentally different than an outcome measure of whether offense or defense advantage or dominance is driving the behavior. So I think that's an important note for your audience and for those taking on the book, whether positively or negatively, is to recognize that we are trying to push us beyond where we've been, both in lexicon, but more importantly, analytically, in how we conceive the space.
And I thought that was really well done in the book, and coming out of a nuclear deterrence background, and you read it in journals and magazines for years. Other behavior, they say, well, deterrence has failed, and basically, is I read what you're saying, it's well, it hasn't failed here, it just isn't really applicable in this space, and so it's a category shift that's necessary. And I thought you guys just laid that out very well, and let there be a debate if people think that that's wrong, but I think you made a very persuasive case. Let me then move us to a political strategic question that I've been dying to ask you guys since I read the book. You wrote that persistent cyber operations in competition can produce, quote, strategic gains or cumulative gains that can shift the balance of power. And that's why this is important. And that's an objective. And I guess that makes sense. But then as I thought more about it, I said, well, what are those gains? How meaningfully does the balance of power shift through cyber competition? And that's not an implicit argument that we shouldn't compete. It's more if the U.S. does compete and its adversaries compete, how much will this mode of competition be expected to actually shift the balance of power? And as I thought about it, and you write about, there are four main competitors thus far: Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. And so you look at it and then start asking, okay, how much did the balance of power shift to North Korea or Iran, for example, or Russia through cyber operations? Or how much has it shifted to the US, in which case, why do we worry so much about what goes on in North Korea or Iran? So take me through the scorekeeping, in a sense, on this question of strategic gain and shifts of balance of power and how that happens, and the degree to which we should really worry about it or feel like it's marginal changes that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think I'll lead us off on that one, George, and step back a little bit on the theory side, and then let Emily and Michael jump in on the application side of this. So I'm going to start with slight caveat you put in there, right, and recognize that we make this argument that initiative persistence is a structural imperative. An imperative is a strong word, right? We're saying this is what the system structures you to do, but ultimately you have a choice to persist or not, right? And also, if you are persisting, you can do it well or you could do it badly. But we're making this argument from a structural theory standpoint that there are consequences if you don't persist. So we do have to start at that base point, right? That you will lose security in relative terms in this space if you are restrained and not engaged. Right? If you do not seek to anticipate exploitation actively, you're going to be exploited because there's so much capacity to do so. There's someone somewhere at some time seeking to exploit you all the time. And so, to a certain extent, for those that work out of the IR theory genre, right, discipline, this is similar to Waltzian logic at the anarchic system level, right, of IR theory, when he talks about the imperative to balance. Right. If you don't, your security is at risk. And once security is at risk, relative power is at risk. And so that's where our starting point is, that if you, given the imperative to have initiative persistence, there's a couple of outcomes. One, you don't, and you're going to suffer, right? But let's take that next step that you're suggesting and say, okay, so states are in fact responding to the imperative. There's basically two outcomes broadly categorized, right, that we can anticipate, or the theory anticipates. One is that major players, the ones that you sort of ticked off, the ones that are most active, in and through cyberspace, are in fact engaging in the anticipation of exploitation before exploitation occurs. And there's a relative standoff, right? That potentially cumulative gains don't accumulate because you're persisting well. So, one of the things when people talk about the U.S. version of this, and for some reasons we can get into later, a lot of people initially thought about persistent engagement as an offensive strategy. It's really, in terms of effects, it's primarily a defensive in its effects, right? And so the point is that if you are the likely outcome of that first thing, that what you were talking about, everybody kind of is engaged in it, everybody's doing it relatively well, you get a relative status quo system outcome. And if you're a status quo state, that's a good outcome. Mm-hmm. If you're a revisionist state, you're going to be less so pleased with that, right? And if you want to shift power in and through cyberspace, you're going to have to become better than the other guys and gals in this space. There's another possibility, right, that someone does it much, much better than others, and that the potential cumulative gains, the potential to accumulate gains, actually accumulates. And this is going to then require sort of effective foreign policy management, because it's really interesting if you take that logic through, George. Do you push those gains too far and strategically unbalance relative power to the point where you necessitate a conventional strategic environment action, right? So we know historically great powers rise and fall. That's not theory, that's reality. But what's unknown right now, and we admit this in the book, is whether those true strategic outcomes, that is shift in relative power at the systemic level, can occur purposely through cyberspace without war occurring. And what's one interesting case is, can you have strategic shift without war? Well, the end of the Cold War actually suggests yes, right? In the nuclear strategic environment, you have a situation in which a global empire fell without a major war occurring. And that's really aberrant in terms of international political history, right? So the question that we raise in the book is whether cyber capabilities are able to, in fact, condense such occurrences to less than 60, 70 years, right? So can I achieve strategic shifts in power via cyber in much shortened periods? So if you don't do it, you're going to suffer. The question that I think you're rightly asking is whether or not you do it and do it well, will these accumulate? And we have evidence, that strategic outcomes are occurring. And I think, Emily, I don't know if you want to perhaps throw in a few points about China, and Mike about North Korea.
Yeah, let me sort of take the theory, kind of bring it down to some concrete situation that we're facing. I think that at least from the U.S. perspective, there was a recognition that whether you want to call it a shift in the balance of power, that there were strategic losses that were being incurred from our adversaries operating in and through cyberspace. Okay. And so you can look at metrics like military overmatch. Okay. Did it degrade the relative military advantage, economic competitiveness, or look at the legitimacy of democratic institutions, right? I mean, the core element of political power for democratic states. And I think there was clearly a recognition that what I'm going to say, inaction on the part of at least the United States incurred a cost, okay, that there was a cost to inaction. Now, I want to be really, really clear. Inaction does not mean offensive aggressive, okay? It means, as Richard said, initiative, okay? It means operating and anticipating. It means working across all elements of national power and with the private sector. What we essentially had, I think, in a prior to 2018, was that the military operational component of that, the cyber capability, was operating under a doctrine of restraint. Okay, I mean, so essentially there was a series of constraints on that. And I think what happened with changes in authorities and policy and law was that it allowed that element of US power to become more engaged in the activity. But once again, it's full spectrum. There's huge defensive component, and you need to be, the defensive piece is really being anticipatory about how do you get out ahead? How do you use the insights you gain from understanding the international community to then make your systems more resilient before they're attacked, as opposed to responding after the fact and relying on a policy of retrospective threat, that if you do this, we will respond. What we recognized is that we were incurring these costs. And because of the cumulative nature of it, what it meant was that any particular single individual hack or incident in itself wasn't strategically consequential, but cumulatively over time, it was, right? So we had to figure out a way to deal with that cumulative gain, as opposed to, in addition, let me say, to dealing with what we might call a significant cyber incident, right? Some sort of a catastrophic destructive attack. We had to look at this cumulative dynamic. So I think there was a real recognition that that losses were being incurred, and we needed to think about that and revise accordingly, at least in the U.S.
Can I jump in, Michael, before you do? Because Emily, you provoked me a little bit, and I'm not quite sure how to formulate it. But from the standpoint, let's say at least of Russia, China, and Iran, when you talk about inaction by the U.S. and U.S. restraint, I mean, haven't they looked at everything in this space as a project of U.S. dominance from the beginning, whether it was who created the internet, who created the big software companies that they all depended on? So, Microsoft, who did the first searches, Google, social media, Facebook, and all of that. So from the and then the Snowden revelations about the NSA being everywhere and so on. So from the rest of the world's perspective, I'm wondering about this restraint that we're talking about, and could you look at what's happened that led to the changes in 2018 as Waltzian balancing by others, in a sense, saying, you guys are in the dominant position. This is unacceptable to us. So we'll hive off things. We'll do other stuff. That doesn't undermine the theory at all. I mean, it's kind of how you narrate it and historically place it, but you end up in the same place where you're going to have this competition. It might affect something we'll get to in a little bit about how you try to use politics and diplomacy and law to moderate it. But I think at the analytic level, all I'm doing, I guess I'm just provoking and tweaking a little bit and saying it still affirms the basic logic of the theory. But Michael, I didn't want you to keep you out.
No, it's an excellent point, George, and I think I can speak to it. By simply saying that states have no doubt recognized that they can impact the international distribution of power by operating in and through cyberspace. So it's not just competing in, it's in and through.
Right.
And so, I'll speak to your to the term scoreboard that you raised in the beginning of your question. So let's talk a little bit about the scoreboard in terms of DPRK and China. But before I do that, I want to offer an analytical distinction. You emphasize changes in relative power, and I'm going to offer that strategic outcomes don't necessarily have to be associated with changes in relative power. They can also be associated with the maintenance of power. And so I've talked about China before in terms of their theft of intellectual property. That's one of their primary motivations, was to halt or at least stave off economic decline, which would have threatened the legitimacy of the regime and put the great power status of China in the eyes of the world in jeopardy. So IP theft, not only does Section 301, as Emily was alluding to, say that it's a relative loss for the United States, it was also a way for China, intellectual property theft, to maintain their status where they were, right? They didn't necessarily gain, but they didn't decline. And so I think a lot of states operate in and through cyberspace to halt decline in addition to possibly increase their relative advantage. DPRK is a good example of that too, right? DPRK has been using cyber for quite some time to circumvent sanctions. So the sanctions, if applied effectively, would lead to the decline of DPRK. But DPRK has effectively circumvented the sanctions. But they've also done better than that, because of the significant amounts of currency they've gotten from the international financial infrastructure and transactions in and through the same. They've accumulated billions of dollars that they apply against their ballistic missile and nuclear programs, to the point where Northcom has assessed that by 2025, if not sooner, they'll be able to basically make our ground-based mid-course intercept system obsolete. Yeah. Right? So that there is a significant change in relative power, right? So they will be able, and we now know that they can also reach the United States with an ICBM. So there it's not, they both halted their decline through circumventing sanctions, and I think arguably shifted the relative balance of power, certainly regionally and possibly internationally through investments in their programs. Richard, you want to talk about Russia for a bit?
Or we can, I don't want to cut George off. We can,
No, go ahead. I'd like to hear the Russia take, especially it's on people's minds, for many reasons, obviously. Yeah.
Yeah, so let's keep it, I think, in the competition space, and then we can talk about, cyber within the crisis and warfight space. But in this competition space, I think, George, the notion, again, from a theory standpoint, counter to Walt's, is if you look at Russia's strategic intent, it's not this traditional rise and compete with the leading state in the system and overtake it, which is what Waltian balancing might predict, or really Mearsheimer offensive realism might predict. It's really about leveling.
Yes.
And so throw out, it's about knocking the United States down a few pegs, yep. Right? And so this is a sort of another nuance to when we talk about how can you have strategic effect on relative power. So you can gain it, you can maintain it, or you can take it away from others, yep. Right? And that doesn't necessarily mean that Russia's becoming stronger, but if I see the world this way and I can start to bring this one down, even if I'm not elevating myself up, then it's significant. And so if you take that perspective, what's really interesting, I think, about cyber capabilities is that they're being used aligned with the strategic placement of states in this relative balance of power, right, or distribution of power. So I agree with Michael, right? We in good part of the book chapter on China talks about this maintaining to deal with the middle income trap, but they're also competing to potentially overtake the United States, right? As in certain areas, particularly in terms of cyber. So if you look at some of the activities that they're engaged in, it seems to promote and support that. But Russia's using these operations and campaigns quite differently, and primarily to undermine the core sources of national U.S. power, right? And that's trust in institutional authority and democratic processes. And so that's fascinating to me from a security studies standpoint, that we can use these. You don't use tanks to go typically and rob banks, right? Right. But the DPKR can go and rob the New York Federal Reserve, the Bangladesh account within that reserve, right? While at the same time, Russia's using it to undermine legitimacy in democratic institutionalism, and China's using it to advance economic relative support, right? So that's also quite interesting when we think about it at that distribution of power level. And if you look at this use case that the New York Times published on in the last day or so about the dedicated effort that Russia made to fracture the women's march movement. And if you haven't seen that analysis, I'd recommend it. Because to me, what's interesting about it, and it suggests that, what it did, they very intentionally were able to exacerbate underlying tensions within the movement and shine light to the point where you did actually get a fracturing of the movement. I don't think what's interesting is that they went and went after a women's march movement. I look at it from a use case scenario and says, you have a social movement or a social group within the United States. You were able to find cleavages in it. You were able to exacerbate those cleavages and make that social movement less effective, right? That's a big takeaway if I'm any kind of international actor that wants to use cyberspace for these kinds of leveling effects.
And each of those responses was terrific, and it calls to mind, how these things evolve. Because I remember when the internet was new, and President Clinton and others were, it's going to bring freedom and democracy to China and all these countries. I mean, so there was a similar kind of, was positive to us sense about in each of the domains that you guys talked about, how it was going to bring change and new opportunities. And then, not surprisingly, there are reactions through the same medium. And so the question, I guess, that your book raises, among many questions, is, okay, what's the action reaction cycle look like over time? We don't know. I mean, you can't predict it, but just to call out that it will continue to probably operate that way is very useful. And it's something that, like, the deterrence, for example, doesn't do, which is just kind of affirming the value of the approach that you've got, that this is going to be kind of ongoing change and dynamics, not kind of stasis and inaction. So I think.
And George, can I make just one point on that? And that is that, we're not offering a normative theory, right? We're not saying whether this is good or bad, right? And in fact, we're trying to offer a structural theory that can help explain state behavior. So if I'm sitting in Moscow, Pyongyang, or Beijing, this is what the theory would expect you to be doing, right? And so it's an explanatory theory rather than taking any sort of normatives.
Well, actually, let me pivot my last set of questions, and I want to open it up. But let me pivot to what may not be normative, but in the latter part of the book, you've argued by then that deterrence and compellence won't work, but then something must be tried at least to change adversary behaviors that we consider hostile, and from their point of view, the other way around. And so then you suggest, again, laudably in my view, that the U.S. and its allies should evolve existing international law and establish customary law to define responsible state behavior and wrongful acts in this domain. And we set aside non-state actors reasonably. And the aim would be over time to motivate states to limit, like in my words, the targets or the effects and collateral damage of operations. So you're going to compete, but it's honor amongst thieves, or creating kind of a code that people do, whether it's mafias, militaries, or otherwise. And the argument is that that restraint ultimately could benefit, if not everyone, at least several of those states that you're talking about, plus the rest of the world, by containing risks of major instability and escalation. And so I guess the question I would have is, as you guys think about it, why would Russia, North Korea, and Iran, change their behavior potentially to comport with those kinds of boundaries or norms or laws, especially as they're interpreted by the U.S.? Now, I think you have answers to that question in tacit bargaining, but take people through, in a sense, how you could try to tame and bound competition.
Michael, you're muted.
Yeah, I can go, Emily. I wondered if you wanted to talk about what the State Department can do.
Well, no, go on. You go first on your, and I'll follow you.
Okay. So George, I really love this question. One of the most fun intellectual play spaces that I entered in working on this book with Emily and Richard was the international law space. Because it is really a rich opportunity a rich space to explore, to try to tackle, the emergence of this new strategic environment. Because, most international lawyers have agreed that while international law applies, they don't quite know how it applies yet in the cyber context, right? And I'm certainly not an international lawyer, and so any comments that we have in the book are really, as an international relations scholar, how would I look at, based on cyber persistence theory, how would we look at international law and how it can be leveraged to encourage stability in this new strategic environment. So I mentioned in our 4 conversation before this kicked off at 10 that this question about international law and why would Russia, China, DPRK abide by new customary international law? I said that my answer to that would be it depends. And so I'm gonna lay into that right now. So I'm going to talk about international law in 2 different ways, right? Changes to international law. I'm going to talk about the emergence of customary international law. And that's how customary international law comes to being, right? It's state behavior. It emerges from consistent state behavior across the majority of states. And then there's actual changes to existing international law, like changes to the rule of non-intervention, changes to understandings of sovereignty, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to talk about 2 different possibilities. So let's talk about the emergence of customary international law. And let's assume, just to pursue some hypotheticals, that states agree that adopting a responsible, initiative persistent cyber doctrine is acceptable, right, in international law. And so it's okay Russia says, yeah, that's fine. Iran says that's fine. China says that's fine. And frankly, take out the word responsible, and they're basically doing initiative persistence anyway, right? And so they may not have an issue with that per se. And if it truly is customary international law, and most states are doing that, right? If they have initiative persistent cyber doctrines, then the consequence of that is that even if Russia, China, and DPRK want to try to do irresponsible things, their opportunities to do so will be foreclosed, right? Because if all the other states are engaging in initiative persistent behavior, they are eliminating vulnerabilities, right? They are constraining irresponsible behavior. They are inhibiting the accumulation of strategic gains. So truly, if initiative persistence becomes the basis of customary international law, that will lead to stability, and the bad actors don't have to change their behaviors, right? I mean, frankly, we wouldn't expect them to. As Richard correctly points out, initiative persistence is an imperative in this space, right? And that's something that international law also needs to recognize. It is an imperative. Right. So any adjustments to international law should recognize that states do have to act for their security in and through this space. Right. So that's one take. Now, what about actual existing international law? Let's say that the rule of non-intervention is reinterpreted not necessarily from coercion as being a key element, but exploitation. Right. So that, for example, if Russia interferes with the United States' ability to distribute COVID vaccines, right, that would be interference in the health policy of the United States. That would be a violation of the rule of non-intervention. If we also make countermeasures, the international law version of countermeasures, much more robust, so that you can have collective countermeasures, or you could even have preemptive countermeasures, that actually provides another lever that states can use against malicious states, right? And the difference between retorsion, which is what states can do unilaterally, that is legal behavior, like the United States routinely sanctions states, for example, for engaging in malicious cyber behavior. Well, countermeasures are things that you can do that normally would be illegal, right? But you're allowed to do them because you're responding to an illegal behavior. So that broadens the scope of potential responses by states and also by a collection of states if collective countermeasures are available. So there are opportunities, I think, to generate norms, if you will, through these types of mechanisms and institutions. Over.
Emily, please.
Let me just, so I think that actually a really interesting use case for this is election security, because that is something that, we've made clear that that is a national priority, a national security priority. And so if you would look over time, starting with 2016, then 2018, then 2020, now 22, and if we can see that the attempts or the level of foreign meddling is declining, I think in part that suggests that, malicious actors are recognizing that maybe the juice just isn't worth the squeeze. Maybe there's just fewer opportunities to be successful in this. And so in that respect, you have kind of the bottom-up behavioral construction of the appropriate behavior and, aligned with kind of top-down, both declaratory policy about what we consider to be crucial to our national security and prosperity, but also, taking those concerns into bilateral and multilateral fora, which, what the State Department has been doing, working at the United Nations. So I think what we're saying here is, these aren't either or, but in fact, they can work together and be more powerful, reinforcing each other.
Mm-hmm. Richard, anything on this? Thanks. You're muted, Richard. Yeah.
Take it, George, down to the operational level as well, right? And so what we're seeing is, I would argue that what we saw early on a decade ago was a lot of experimentation, and now we're starting to see refinement, and that refinement can reinforce some base principles that make the system, at least at its core, resilient, and the effects, the collateral effects, more contained. So if you look at, take NotPetya versus solar winds, for example, right? I'd rather see, again, not being normative, not being a national perspective here. I'd rather see solar winds than NotPetya.
Sure.
Right? NotPetya, you have a targeted attack that has enormous, if you will, collateral damage. Right? It takes down Maersk. It takes down other. You've got backups on New Jersey Turnpike because the Port of Elizabeth is not functioning properly. Solar wind's a lot cleaner. You don't see that type of knock-on effect. Lots of entities exploited, right? But much more controlled. You look at the Chinese hafnium attack, and really, really sloppy or if you will, indifferent about leaving backdoors that criminal activity could follow, right? So that's something we don't want to see. And you can actually talk to each other. It doesn't have to always be operational against operational. But to say, hey, that's a legitimate type of initiative, persistent exploitation of vulnerability, but not in the manner in which you did it. Mm-hmm. Right. And so part of that becomes, as you noted, we talk about in the book, that tacit bargaining is not a replacement of explicit bargaining. It's a supplement to and a reinforcement of. But that means that you have to behave within the parameters that you want to set. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I think if you are a status quo state, generally speaking, and a state that has an operational capacity that's broader and deeper than other states, that gives you choices, right? And so the theory would suggest in our chapter on stability that you'd make strategic choices. So while you respond to the imperative, you still have strategic latitude in terms of the actual operational latitude about how you pursue initiative persistence. And there may be things that you can do that you take off the table, right? Because you don't want to encourage that type of activity in the long haul. And it's going to be interesting to see. That's what the theory would predict states would do to stabilize this space. And the final reason, to get to your original question, is look, if you want to play a game, you want to have an agreement on the rules of the game, right? And that way you can get better at playing that game, and you're going to be confident that you could possibly win, right? And so most state actors in this space are not anarchists, right? They don't see their interests being forwarded by destroying the system. In fact, they see their interests being forwarded by working in and through the system and exploiting those opportunities wherever they can.
There's a lot there, and so a couple quick reactions, and then we have another question. But one thought is going back to, I thought Richard, your very apt point about Russia and the interest in leveling, and from my Soviet studies day, that was a domestic issue in Russia for centuries as well. I may not be able to rise, my group may not be able to rise, but I can bring the other ones down. And so when you talk the interest in maybe having kind of rules for a game, I think China is very different from Russia, perhaps, in that regard. And so that's a challenge in a sense for US and other policymakers. If we're going to have, as you guys imply, and I would urge, more explicit conversations with them about, we know you're going to do stuff, we're going to do stuff, but can we talk about effects that we want to avoid because we have mutual interest in avoiding certain effects? That's a really useful thing to do. That conversation may be different with different actors. And so, and obviously we don't have it with North Korea at all, which you guys all know, but I think for follow-on work, either by commentators or others, to kind of delineate more how one would do that stuff. So that was kind of the tail end of the book, for very understandable reasons, because the huge innovation of the book was the structural description and analysis. And I just, would welcome if you and or others then pick up on that in future work and elaborate on what you've been doing now, because it's very interesting. And the last kind of question on that, and then I'll turn to the audience question, is in practice and also in customary law building or restraint building, there's a big distinction between intelligence gathering and other things. And amongst the distinctions, and you guys know this all like 10 times better than I do, amongst the distinctions is, you talk more about one than you talk about the other. But in cyber, it may be, correct me if I'm wrong, it may be hard for the recipient to distinguish if they detect something, whether it was for intelligence or something else. And therefore, does that complicate the restraint development and potential bargaining and so on that we're talking about to put bounds on things, if it's difficult to distinguish intelligence from operations? You know the question better than I've stated it. So if either of you or any of you could play it out, I'd like to hear the thinking there.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah. Richard, do you want to offer a thought? I have a thought.
Yeah, just my quick thought, George, is this is really hard. And so, yeah, and so one of the reasons why in the book we argue, that these are not useful tools for signaling necessarily and shaping, but rather through pattern, right? And so it's going to take time, and we have to be just humble in the context that we're very still early in this engaged environment. Michael?
Yeah, George, I would say that consequence is a key discriminant. That that, plenty of espionage goes on where you don't know what's going on. And even if you do know what's going on, sometimes, like you're okay with it. But if a state engages in a cyber activity that especially if accumulates over time, has an obvious strategic consequence, that's one that you're going to want to push back on.
Yeah, very helpful. Emily?
Obviously, when you look at that technical level, you're absolutely right. I think this kind of circles back to a comment that I made earlier that you followed up on, and we didn't close the loop on that, looking at, we kind of talk about it in terms of intelligence versus effects, right? Are you creating effects, right? And that's really the concern, because there isn't there is an international acceptance that espionage is going to take place. Now, we have to recognize that what cyber has done is it has scaled that to a point where it is qualitatively different, right? And so then that should open up a conversation about, well, how has that changed it, right? How has that changed that sort of norm for espionage, to saying now we can do it at such a massive scale. And you're absolutely right. It's not clear how you can then pivot to some sort of an effect. But also, if you kind of put it more back into the domestic context and the perceptions of adversaries to, or other countries to, the United States, we segment our intelligence and our operational, our military, let's say, activities in a way that others do not, right? So this really goes to your point earlier about the fact that how does that affect the perceptions of what the United States is doing, right? And to what extent is the intelligence agency, the national security agency, viewed as synonymous with the military operational arm that might have the mission to create effects, right? And to our adversaries, it doesn't really make a difference, right? I mean, it's all the U.S. And moreover, I put on top of that, from their perspective, private sector is part and parcel of the United States too, even though our model is not that way. So I think that raises a whole series of issues in terms of not only how we operate in the technical issue, but also the political perceptions about what the intent is.
As well put, and competitors' perceptions and everything. Absolutely. Let's, for a last question, turn to one from the audience, unless somebody else pops up another one. And the question is, could you elaborate on the difference between deterrence and tacit bargaining? Is it a difference in tactics, modalities for the same end goal of shaping adversary behavior, or are the goals different? Interesting question. Who would like to go first? Michael,
well, it's always dangerous when there's a question on deterrence and I go before Dr. Harknett, since this is his lane of expertise. But I'll take a risk here. So the obvious difference here is that deterrence is a strategy, and tacit bargaining is a tactic. I think you could certainly, in a deterrence strategy, engage in tacit bargaining. For example, as part of a deterrence strategy, you could show force, right? Or you could mobilize troops, which is in essence tacit communication, right? Because you're not explicitly saying, I'm going to do this, you just do it. But in the cyber strategic environment, we say that it elevates in importance as a tactic, right? Because cyberspace itself, its interconnectedness facilitates interaction, and interaction is the key to developing understandings through tacit bargaining. So we think about it differently due to the core characteristics of the cyber strategic environment. Richard.
Yeah, it's a good question, George. Building off of what Michael just said, right? So there's a difference between tacit communication and tacit bargaining, right? So the show of force, things of that nature, we're going to communicate intent or will or things of that nature, right? But what we're arguing is that behaviorally, over time, you can start to set these parameters. And so it was back to what I was talking about earlier, right? That you may have the capacity to do things, but it is, and it may be in your short-term interest to use that capacity in an operation, but is it in your long-term, right? And so part of recognizing that there may be a utility to tacitly bargaining with your competitors is that it reinforces a recognition that you should think about cyber campaigning under a strategic context. Where do you want to wind up in this, right, relative to other adversaries? And the challenge that we face in the 21st century across all of these major states is that because of interconnectedness, every single one of them are affecting every single one of them, right? And so it's not this sort of static bipolar nuclear competition in which, you know, I can count warheads and think about strategic stability against one other adversary. Obviously, that's a broad brush simplification of what we experienced during those 70 years, but a lot more complex because we have so many more actors that are relevant from a capacity and capability standpoint and from an incentive standpoint. And then, so I think that's where the answer lies, right? That it's about setting some parameters. What we argue in the book is that what's emerging through this pattern of behavior is sort of a low end and a high end that defines a competition space, right? That these are operations and cyber campaigns that are clearly, it's quite aberrant when they appear to be similar to armed attack equivalents, right? But on a daily basis, we have operations and campaigns being conducted well short of that, but they're being conducted, right? Nobody's sitting on their hands anymore in this space. So there's this space of action, but action short of armed attack equivalents. And what we did in the book was borrowed from good old Herman Kahn and some of the old language and sort of turned it on its head and said, you know, is there essentially through behavior an agreement that much of what we're going to do in and through cyberspace is the majority of this behavior is exploitation within those parameters, right? And then what'll be interesting to see is if that holds, if there's an agreed competition space, and we're not getting, you know, Leon Panetta's cyber 9/11, right? We're not getting that catastrophic attack because deterrence is working at that level. Deterrence works at war avoidance. And it doesn't matter whether I attack with kinetic force, nuclear force, or code. Armed attack is armed attack, and it falls under that crisis management and war fight environment, and deterrence is highly relevant there, right? But in this competition space, can we gain security? It comes down to making sure that these ultimate consequences that flow from these operations and campaigns don't actually accumulate to the point where they affect my relative power. And that is what we think is going to be the primary, not the only, primary, the primary behavior that we see in this space, which is very different than what we were thinking 20 years ago as cyberspace emerged. And most of our focus was on that catastrophic, significant outcome.
Yep, great. Emily, I'm going to give you the last word on this or on any of the other topics that we've covered. But I appreciate the arc that we've traveled over. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I just want to wrap up by just highlighting some things for the audience that, you know, language is really important in terms of how we think. And if you sort of listen to our conversation here, to the extent that we're talking about campaigns versus incidents or intrusions or hacks, if we can sort of use that language and be in that space, that's already getting us to think about the cumulative impact over time, right, of these activities. And similarly, you know, in the deterrence language, we talk about preventing. And what we see from cyber persistence, it's not about preventing, because you're never going to be able to prevent everything, right? It's trying to prevent strategically consequential impact, whether from a significant incident or from the cumulative impact over time. So it's about precluding certain behaviors, right? Not preventing. To bring it back up to a even more of a policy level, we sort of set ourselves up for failure, I think, when we talk about our goal is to prevent this behavior, because we have to recognize the structural imperative and the incentives in the system. We're not going to be able to prevent it. So we need to be able to communicate about what the expectations are, both to our overseers, right, and to leaders, as well as recognizing that. So I just want to put the pitch in that the book makes the case for this new lexicon of thinking about it, and I think that's really important contribution in terms of both the research community and the policy community.
That was a great close. That was super apt. So thank you, Emily. I mean, thank you, Michael and Richard too. But the way you put the bow on it was really well done there, Emily. I hope everybody who was visiting with us found this as interesting and thought-provoking as I did. And I want to thank you all and urge those of you who haven't read the book to do so. You'll find it was a very useful way to spend however fast you read, a few hours or days. With that, we're going to sign off and wish you all well. Take care.